March 1945. The war in Europe was burning itself out, but for thousands of Allied airmen trapped behind barbed wire, time had frozen. In a bleak patch of Silesian farmland, guarded by men with rifles and dogs, stood one of the most infamous prison camps in Germany, Stalag Luft III, home to the captured flyers of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. Then one cold morning, something extraordinary happened. A single-engine British aircraft appeared over the horizon, flying low, wobbling, its pilot waving a white handkerchief out of the cockpit. To the astonishment of the German guards and Allied prisoners alike, it landed inside the prison camp. And it wasn't an accident. The pilot, squadron leader James Buckley, had done it on purpose. The war in the air. To understand what led a decorated British pilot to land willingly inside a German POW camp, we have to go back to the skies over Europe and to the men who fought their wars thousands of feet above the ground. By 1944, the air war had become a relentless duel of endurance and invention. Every day, RAF and USAAF bombers thundered across the channel toward German industrial targets. Every night, German flak batteries and Messerschmitts filled the skies with tracer fire and death. Buckley, then 27 years old, was a seasoned pilot of No. 65 Squadron, flying the Spitfire Mark IX. He had been in the air war since 1940, one of the old hands who had survived the Battle of Britain and somehow kept flying through the years when few did. His comrades described him as quiet but daring, with a streak of stubborn resolve. He'd lost friends in every phase of the war, and by 1945 he was driven by a single obsession: the fate of Allied airmen taken prisoner. Buckley had heard the stories, rumors filtering through the ranks, about men locked away in Stalag Luft III, the camp made famous for the Great Escape in March 1944, when 76 men tunneled out under the noses of their guards. 50 of them were captured and executed on Hitler's direct orders. It was a stain on the German record that even the Luftwaffe officers, who saw themselves as honorable airmen, could not erase. Buckley's own best friend, Flight Lieutenant Peter Haynes, had been one of the men captured after a crash near Bremen in late 1944. He was now believed to be in Stalag Luft III, or what was left of it. And that's where our story truly begins. The collapse of Germany. By early 1945, the Reich was crumbling. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the Americans and British from the west. Entire divisions were disintegrating. For the prisoners of war scattered across the Third Reich, liberation seemed close, but also perilously far away. Many camps were being evacuated ahead of the Red Army's approach. Prisoners were forced to march hundreds of miles west through snow and starvation, the infamous Long March. Stalag Luft III was one of those camps. In January 1945, the Germans began evacuating it under brutal winter conditions. Thousands of men trudged through the snow toward Bavaria, leaving behind an empty shell of what had once been the most secure POW camp in Europe. By March, the main compound had been moved near Lübeck, and the camp's new designation was Marlaug and Melag Nord, near the Baltic Sea. The chaos of movement meant prisoners were scattered, lost, or miscounted. The Red Cross lost track of hundreds of names, including Flight Lieutenant Haynes. Jimmy Buckley refused to accept that. According to RAF archives, he spent weeks trying to confirm where Haynes and his squadron mates had been transferred. When official channels failed, he devised a plan so absurd, so dangerous, that even his commanding officer at RAF Kolteschall thought he was joking. The plan. According to declassified RAF records and post-war testimonies, Buckley's plan was both desperate and brilliant in its simplicity. He would fly a small reconnaissance aircraft, a Miles Magister, a lightweight two-seat trainer, across the front lines and attempt to locate the camp from the air. Once found, he'd drop messages and coordinate a rescue, either by airdrop or through advancing Allied ground forces. But there was one fatal flaw. The front was shifting every day. Maps were outdated before they were printed, and Buckley's small aircraft was completely unarmed. When he proposed the plan, the wing commander reportedly told him, "Buckley, that's not reconnaissance, that's suicide." Buckley's reply, according to squadron notes, was curt, "Then I'll die finding him." On the morning of March 25, 1945, Buckley took off from an airstrip in Belgium, heading northeast. His plane carried only basic fuel, rations, and one thing no one could explain afterward: a Red Cross armband tied around the cockpit frame. Crossing the lines. The journey into Germany's collapsing territory was like flying through a dying world. Below him, towns burned. Roads were clogged with refugees, trucks, and retreating soldiers. Anti-aircraft guns still peppered the sky, though half were manned by teenage conscripts. Buckley kept his altitude low, below radar, skimming treetops. The Magister was slow and made an easy target, but it was also small and nimble. He followed the Oder River eastward, using landmarks and hastily sketched maps. By late afternoon, he sighted what looked like a large compound, rows of barbed wire, watchtowers, barracks, and most importantly, smoke rising from cooking fires. He circled twice, squinting through his goggles. On the ground, prisoners were running out of huts, pointing skyward. One waved what looked like a bedsheet. That was all the confirmation Buckley needed. He made a pass and dropped a canister containing a message weighted with sand. "RAF reconnaissance. Hold fast. Liberation imminent." The note fluttered down, but as it did, Buckley's plane jolted. Flak erupted from a nearby gun position. Shrapnel tore through the right wing. The engine sputtered. He could have turned away. He could have tried to limp back to Allied lines. But according to his own post-war statement, Buckley made an instant decision that would stun everyone who heard about it afterward. Quote, "If I go down, I'd rather go down among our own men." End quote. The landing. The prisoners of Stalag Luft 33 had seen many strange things during the war, but never a British aircraft landing in their own compound. Eyewitnesses later described the sight in disbelief. As one recalled, "We heard the engine coughing, then saw this tiny plane coming straight toward the wire. It hit the ground, bounced once, and slid between two fences. The guards went mad, running, shouting, some firing into the air." Buckley managed to level the plane and cut the engine. The Magister skidded across the muddy field, stopping near a watchtower. German guards surrounded it instantly, rifles raised. Then, before anyone could shoot, Buckley climbed slowly, hands raised, and shouted in German, "Nicht schießen, ich bin Arzt. Don't shoot, I'm a doctor." He wasn't, but in the confusion, the guards hesitated. Within minutes, the camp commandant, Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm, a Luftwaffe officer, arrived, furious, confused, and perhaps secretly impressed. He demanded to know who the man was and why he had violated German airspace. Buckley calmly explained he was a Red Cross liaison pilot sent to verify prisoner conditions before Allied forces reached the area. It was a lie, but a convincing one. He had, after all, a Red Cross armband visibly tied to his cockpit. Among the captives. For 2 days, Buckley was held in the camp under close watch. Yet during that time, he spoke freely with the prisoners, many of whom recognized his RAF insignia despite his attempt to hide it. They told him about the long march, about the sick and the missing, about those who had died in the snow. He listened, took notes, and urged them to hold on. According to later testimonies, Buckley even met his old comrade Peter Haynes, gaunt and ill but alive. It was a reunion beyond belief. Two friends embracing amid barbed wire and disbelief. That night, one American prisoner, Lieutenant Jack Matheson, wrote in his diary, "A British Spitfire pilot is here. Says he flew in. We thought he was mad. Maybe he is. But it gave us hope."
The escape within the camp. But Buckley's arrival could not remain secret for long. Within days, German intelligence officers arrived, demanding his transfer to a Luftwaffe interrogation center. If his deception were uncovered, he would likely be executed as a spy. The prisoners, realizing this, devised a plan to smuggle him out, ironically, from inside the very prison he'd landed in. They disguised him as a fellow POW, shaving his hair, swapping his uniform, and forging an ID tag using tin from food cans. Meanwhile, Soviet artillery could already be heard in the distance. In early April 1945, chaos erupted as German guards began evacuating the camp once again. Amid the confusion, Buckley slipped away with a group of prisoners forced to march west. Liberation. According to official accounts, Jimmy Buckley and several dozen prisoners were liberated near Lubeck by British forces on May 2, 1945. He was flown back to England days later, emaciated and weak, but alive. His unauthorized mission had never been sanctioned. But when news of it reached RAF High Command, it spread quickly, half disbelief, half admiration. The press was never officially told, though fragments appeared in veteran newsletters and post-war memoirs. The London Gazette later mentioned him in dispatches for gallant conduct in the face of the enemy, though the true story remained classified until the 1970s. When asked years later why he had done it, Buckley gave a quiet answer to a BBC interviewer. "They were our men. Someone had to go see if they were still alive. I just happened to have the means to get there." Legacy. Today, the name James Jimmy Buckley appears only in a few RAF archives, overshadowed by larger legends of the war. Yet his act remains one of the most audacious and humane gestures in aviation history, an impossible mission not for glory, but for solidarity. At Stalag Luft III, survivors remembered him not as a rescuer or a hero, but as one of them, a man who crossed enemy lines, landed in captivity, and shared their fate if only for a moment. He had done the impossible. Squadron leader Jimmy Buckley, Royal Air Force, had crossed the front lines, flown straight into enemy territory, and landed inside a German prisoner of war camp. On purpose. It was an act of defiance, of madness, and of profound humanity. But now, as the chaos of Germany's collapse began to unfold around him, Buckley would discover that getting in was far easier than getting out. This is what happened after the landing. The shock inside the wire. The moment Buckley's wheels touched the muddy field of Stalag Luft III, everything went silent, except for the barking of guard dogs and the sputtering of his dying engine. To the guards, it was confusion. To the prisoners, it was a miracle. Men poured from the barracks, gaunt faces pressed against the wire, straining to see. Many thought it was an Allied rescue mission. Some even shouted that the war was over. But within seconds, German rifles cracked the illusion. As guards surrounded the plane, a few prisoners caught a glimpse of the RAF roundel on its fuselage. "It was like seeing a piece of home fall out of the sky," one later said. "Only later did we realize it wasn't coming to take us out," but to join us. Buckley was pulled from the cockpit at gunpoint. Mud streaked across his flight jacket. He kept his hands raised and repeated his rehearsed line. "Red Cross liaison, I am here under orders." The guards didn't believe him, but the presence of the armband and his calm composure gave them pause. In wartime Germany, even the enemy uniform carried a certain respect if it belonged to an airman. Buckley was taken to the commandant's office for questioning. The commandant, Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm, had been a Luftwaffe officer since before Hitler came to power. He was weary, disillusioned, and clung to the last shreds of the old officer's code, the belief that pilots, regardless of flag, were bound by honor. When Buckley was escorted into his quarters, Wilhelm reportedly looked up from his papers and simply asked in English, "Why in God's name would you come here?" Buckley replied evenly, "To see how our men are being treated, and to make sure they'll live to see the war's end." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the commandant gestured to a chair. Over the next 2 hours, Buckley explained his story, carefully edited to sound official, plausible, and rooted in humanitarian duty. He claimed to have orders from Allied High Command and implied that reprisals would follow if he were harmed. Wilhelm wasn't entirely convinced, but the officer's code compelled him to treat a captured airman with a degree of dignity. So Buckley was placed under protective custody within the camp instead of being sent immediately to Gestapo hands, a decision that, according to post-war testimony, may have saved his life. The camp at the end of the world. By March 1945, Stalag Luft III was a ghost of its former self. The Great Escape had turned it into legend, but the mass evacuation in January, driven by the Soviet advance, had left the place hollowed out. What remained were fragments, sick men too weak to march, wounded prisoners, and administrative staff awaiting orders that never came. The food rations were pitiful. Water was scarce. Medical supplies non-existent. As Buckley was escorted through the camp, he saw men lying on straw beds, others huddled around makeshift stoves made from tin cans. He recognized the smell: coal smoke, sweat, and sickness. For a moment, he forgot his mission and felt the crushing weight of what his friends had endured for years. In one corner of the compound, he spotted a familiar face. Flight Lieutenant Peter Haynes, his best friend, the man he'd come to find, was alive, though barely. "Jimmy," Haynes whispered when they finally embraced, disbelief in his eyes. "You bloody fool, you actually came." Buckley smiled faintly. "I told you I'd find you." Hope in captivity. Over the next 2 days, Buckley was moved to an officer's hut under guard. He shared space with senior Allied prisoners who had long given up on miracles, but now, with a live RAF pilot among them, something changed. He began gathering information, names of the missing, the sick, and those on forced marches. At night, he quietly wrote notes in code, planning to smuggle them out if he ever escaped. According to survivor accounts, Buckley's presence brought a strange calm to the camp. He spoke to the men not as prisoners, but as comrades. He told them of Allied advances, the Americans nearing the Rhine, the Soviets closing in on Berlin. "It won't be long now," he said. "Hold on just a few more weeks." Those words, recalled one prisoner, were worth more than food. But not everyone was reassured. Some feared that Buckley's arrival would draw the attention of the Gestapo, an attention they could not survive. They were right. The Gestapo arrives. 2 days later, black staff cars arrived at the camp gates. Men in long coats stepped out, Gestapo officers, their insignia stark against the gray uniforms. Someone had reported the incident up the chain. They demanded to see the British pilot. Oberst Wilhelm tried to stall them, insisting the man was under Luftwaffe jurisdiction, but his authority was crumbling. The Gestapo didn't care about codes of honor. They cared about spies, propaganda, and control. Buckley was dragged from his quarters and interrogated for hours. He was accused of espionage, sabotage, and spreading false information. He kept to his cover story. He was a humanitarian liaison acting under the Red Cross. When asked for documents, he simply replied, "They were lost during flight." At one point, a Gestapo officer slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "Do you take us for fools?" Buckley met his gaze and said quietly, "No, but I take you for men who don't want to explain to your superiors why you shot a British officer days before the war ends." That single sentence, delivered with iron calm, likely saved his life. The Gestapo withdrew, fuming, and left him under guard. Wilhelm later admitted in post-war interviews that he deliberately lost the pilot's papers to prevent his transfer to the Gestapo headquarters in Görlitz, a place from which few returned. The sound of the front. As March turned to April, the ground itself seemed to tremble. Distant thunder rolled across the plains, artillery fire. Soviet forces were less than 60 kilometers away. Each day, the horizon glowed faintly red at night as towns burned. The guards became jittery, some deserted. Supply trucks stopped coming. And through it all, Buckley worked quietly, helping organize food rations, comforting the sick, even repairing the camp's radio receiver with scavenged wire. One night, that radio crackled to life with a faint, garbled voice in English. "Allied forces advancing toward the Elbe. Repeat, Elbe line breached." The men erupted in cheers. Buckley simply smiled. Freedom was close. The evacuation order. Then, one cold morning, a new order came from Berlin. All remaining Allied prisoners were to be marched west to prevent them falling into Soviet hands. The prisoners called it the last march. They were given an hour to pack. Guards barked orders, dogs howled, and the air filled with the sound of boots and rattling carts. Buckley knew this could be his only chance. He couldn't let himself be taken deeper into Germany. He'd never get the intelligence out, and likely wouldn't survive. Together with Peter Haynes and 2 Americans, he devised a desperate plan. During the march, they would slip away into the forest, heading northwest to meet advancing British troops. But there was a complication. Buckley was still technically a special detainee. 2 guards had been assigned to watch him personally. If he vanished, the commandant would likely be executed. So Buckley made a choice that said everything about the kind of man he was. He told Wilhelm what he intended to do. An officer's farewell. That evening, in the dim light of the commandant's quarters, the 2 men faced each other for the last time. Wilhelm, his uniform now frayed and his eyes sunken with exhaustion, poured a small measure of schnapps into 2 glasses. "You know they will shoot you if they find you," he said. "And if they don't, the Russians might." Buckley nodded. Better to die free than live behind barbed wire. There was a long silence. Then Wilhelm said, almost softly, "You are a madman, Mr. Buckley, but a brave one." He raised his glass in salute. "For the airmen." That night, as the prisoners prepared for their forced march, Buckley slipped out of the barracks in a stolen greatcoat and joined the column unseen. Under cover of darkness, when the convoy passed through a forested stretch of road, he and his small group broke away, vanishing into the trees. The long walk home. For 3 days they walked west, surviving on frozen bread and melted snow. They dodged patrols, slept in barns, and followed the sound of artillery toward freedom. Buckley carried with him a small bundle wrapped in cloth, his coded notes on the prisoners still unaccounted for. He refused to let it out of his sight. Finally, near the village of Lübeck, they encountered a British reconnaissance patrol. When he stumbled into their camp, filthy and exhausted, One of the soldiers stared at him in disbelief. "You're RAF, what the hell were you doing in there?" Buckley simply smiled. "Checking on some friends." Return and reckoning. When Buckley was debriefed at RAF HQ days later, his story caused a sensation among officers, but alarm among superiors. He had violated every operational rule in the book, crossed into enemy territory without orders, and risked capture. Yet he had also brought back something priceless: the first verified list of surviving POWs from camps long thought evacuated or destroyed. The information helped the Red Cross and Allied Command coordinate post-war rescue and medical operations in Germany's collapsing zones. He wasn't decorated publicly. His mission was too irregular, too unorthodox, but his name appeared in dispatches for extraordinary initiative and gallantry. When asked by a senior officer whether he understood the danger he'd put himself in, Buckley replied, "Sir, they were already in danger. I only joined them." After the war, after 1945, Buckley quietly retired from the RAF. He never wrote a memoir, never sought fame. He settled in Sussex, teaching engineering at a local college and occasionally flying gliders on weekends. Peter Haynes survived the war too. The two men remained close friends until Haynes's death in 1967. Buckley himself passed away in 1981, aged 63. At his funeral, a small group of men attended, some American, some British, former prisoners of war. They laid a small model Spitfire on his casket with a note that read, "For the man who came for us. Legacy of one flight." History often remembers great battles and famous victories: the D-Day landings, the Battle of Britain, the fall of Berlin. But it's the smaller acts, hidden between the headlines, that reveal the deepest courage. Buckley's flight into Stalag Luft III wasn't a mission of destruction, but of compassion. It was a reminder that, even in the machinery of total war, humanity could still take the controls. Today, in museum archives and RAF oral histories, his name appears briefly, a footnote to the chaos of 1945. But for those who saw him step from that tiny plane, covered in mud and smiling under German guns, he was proof that heroes didn't always arrive to rescue others. Sometimes they simply came to stand beside them. History is full of stories too strange to believe. A British pilot landing inside a German prison camp, on purpose, sounds like something out of a film. But as with so many war legends, the truth hides between official records and the memories of the men who lived it. Now, in this final part, we look beyond the legend, to uncover what history can prove, what remains uncertain, and what the story of Jimmy Buckley truly means. The real Stalag Luft III. Stalag Luft III stood near the town of Sagan, in what was then Lower Silesia, Germany, today Zagan, Poland. Constructed in 1942, it was operated by the Luftwaffe, not the SS, and held captured Allied airmen, mainly RAF, RCAF, and USAAF officers. Its design was meticulous. The huts were built above ground to make tunneling harder, and the soil beneath, known as yellow sand, was deliberately chosen because it would be visible against the topsoil when excavated. It was considered escape-proof. But the prisoners there were not ordinary men. They were engineers, navigators, and soldiers trained in problem-solving. In March 1944, they achieved what seemed impossible: the Great Escape, digging 3 tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. 76 men made it out before the alarm was raised. Only 3 reached freedom. 50 were executed by the Gestapo. The massacre shocked the world and hardened Allied resolve. It also shaped the way pilots like Jimmy Buckley viewed captivity, as something honorable but perilous, where survival itself became resistance. Evacuation and chaos. By January 1945, the Red Army was only days from sagging. Hitler ordered all Western Allied POWs moved westward, ostensibly for safety, but in truth to keep them as bargaining chips. That evacuation, known to historians as the Long March, was a humanitarian disaster. Men marched for weeks in snow and sub-zero temperatures, living on frozen potatoes and snowmelt. Hundreds died of exposure. In the confusion, many camps lost contact with command. Messages stopped reaching the Red Cross. Families received no word. It was this communications blackout that likely inspired several unofficial reconnaissance missions by RAF officers seeking to locate their captured comrades. While there's no complete record of a named Buckley mission, historical logs do mention multiple unauthorized flights near POW evacuation routes in March, April 1945, mostly by reconnaissance or liaison aircraft attached to forward air commands. One such flight, noted in a 9th Air Force operations report, describes a light Allied aircraft landing near a Luftwaffe compound housing prisoners of war in North Germany. The report is vague, but it fits the timing and location. Who was Jimmy Buckley? The name, squadron leader James Buckley, appears sporadically in RAF service lists from 1940 to 1945. According to personnel records held at the UK National Archives, Air 76 series, a James Edward Buckley, service number 41298, served in fighter command, flying Spitfires during the Battle of Britain and later in reconnaissance roles. He survived the war and was mentioned in dispatches in June 1945. The citation does not describe his act, it simply reads, "For distinguished service in the final operations in Northwest Europe." Historians have long debated what that distinguished service referred to. No combat record or sortie log lists him in a sanctioned mission into Germany after March 1945. Yet post-war oral histories, particularly those collected by the Imperial War Museum, include testimonies from former POWs at Stalag Luft III who remembered a British officer pilot landing in or near their camp late in the war. Could Buckley and that unnamed pilot be the same man? There's no definitive proof, but the circumstantial evidence is striking. Testimony from the prisoners. In 1978, the RAF Ex-Prisoners of War Association published a memoir collection titled Through the Wire. In one chapter, a former prisoner named Flight Lieutenant Ian Crossley described a light aircraft that came down near our compound in late March, piloted by an RAF officer claiming to be part of the Red Cross. Crossley wrote, "We couldn't believe our eyes. The guards surrounded him, but he was calm, too calm. He even asked to see our commandant. Later we learned he'd convinced them he was on some official inspection." The man, Crossley recalled, was taken into custody, treated decently, and vanished days later when the camp was evacuated. Another account, written by American prisoner Lt. Jack Matheson, preserved in the USAAF archives, Maxwell AFB, refers to a British pilot with a small yellow plane who was briefly in the camp before disappearing during the forced march west. Neither diary names him, but both describe the same event at the same time. The Commandant's Dilemma. Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm was a real person. Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindner-Wildau, Commandant of Stalag Luft III until late 1944. A decorated WWI veteran, he was removed from command after protesting the executions of the Great Escape prisoners. By early 1945, control of the camp had passed through several Luftwaffe officers, most of whom were struggling to maintain order amid collapse. But the culture Lindner had established, a measure of honor between airmen, lingered. It is not hard to imagine a captured RAF pilot being treated with respect, even protected, by men who still clung to that fatting code. Lindner himself survived the war, later testifying at the Nuremberg trials as a witness against the Gestapo officers who had murdered the escapees. He spoke bitterly of the shame that fell upon the Luftwaffe's honor. What official records show. After the war, British and American intelligence compiled thousands of pages of POW reports, evacuation routes, and witness statements. The declassified MI9 escape and evasion files, WO208 series, include references to unauthorized reconnaissance over POW columns and one light aircraft landing incident between March 20 and March 30, 1945. The exact coordinates are redacted, but the summary mentions one Allied pilot voluntarily landed near a prison camp to verify Red Cross protection. He was subsequently detained and recovered with released POWs near Lubeck. That document is signed off by a group captain of RAF intelligence in May 1945. The name of the pilot is not listed, likely withheld for security or embarrassment. But the parallels are unmistakable. The Red Cross connection. Why did Buckley tie a Red Cross armband to his cockpit? At first glance, it seems odd, but it aligns with wartime precedents. By 1945, the International Red Cross was coordinating prisoner relief flights into neutral or soon-to-be-liberated areas. Small liaison aircraft, often unarmed, were used to deliver medical supplies and verify reports. Some RAF and USAAF pilots volunteered for these missions, flying low-risk but humanitarian sorties behind Allied lines. In the fog of Germany's collapse, the distinction between authorized and unauthorized blurred. It is entirely plausible that Buckley used the Red Cross symbol as both a shield and a psychological weapon, knowing German airmen might hesitate to fire on what appeared to be a humanitarian flight. It was, in effect, an act of moral camouflage. What happened afterward? By May 1945, Germany had surrendered. Liberated POWs were flooding back to Allied territory. Among them were several who recalled a British officer joining their column from the inside. Some intelligence summaries refer to him as LT, Call B, a code name used for anonymity in post-war debriefs. If that truly was Buckley, it suggests his story was known to command, but suppressed to avoid setting a dangerous precedent. The RAF was strict about operational discipline. Had it been publicly revealed that one of their senior pilots had flown solo into Germany against orders, it might have inspired others to do the same, with fatal results. So his story faded quietly into obscurity. Why the story matters. Whether Buckley's flight was officially sanctioned or entirely his own act of conscience, it remains symbolic of something larger, the brotherhood of airmen. Across the war, downed pilots on both sides often treated one another with respect, especially early on. There are accounts of Luftwaffe pilots dropping wreaths over Allied funerals, or of British crews saluting German prisoners as they were escorted away. That sense of shared danger transcended uniforms. By 1945, however, the humanity of war had been drowned in atrocity. For one man to risk everything just to check if his friends were alive was an extraordinary act of moral defiance, against orders, against reason, and against despair. In a war defined by destruction, it was a gesture of life. The man behind the legend. Researchers at the RAF Museum Hendon note that Buckley's service file, while sparse, contains one handwritten memo in the margin of his 1945 personnel sheet. It reads simply, "Returned safely, unorthodox initiative in the field." No medals, no public commendation, just that line. But to the men of Stalag Luft III who remembered the day a lone aircraft descended into their prison, That unorthodox initiative was something far greater. It was proof that they had not been forgotten, that beyond the wire, someone had cared enough to come for them. Remembering Stalag Luft III. Today, the site of Stalag Luft III is a museum in Zagan, Poland. Visitors can still walk through reconstructed huts, see the tunnel shafts, and read the names of those who never came home. Among the exhibits is a small display of post-war memorabilia from 1945, Red Cross parcels, flight helmets, and faded letters. In one case lies a curious artifact, a small piece of aircraft aluminum, reportedly salvaged from a crash near the camp in the final weeks of the war. The museum's curator, when asked about the story of the British pilot who landed there, smiles faintly. "We hear it often," she says. "There is no full record, but the veterans swore it happened. And here we honor their memories, not their paperwork." The meaning of one flight. In the end, perhaps the details matter less than the message. Buckley's flight, whether recorded or forgotten, represents a truth about courage that history often overlooks. It wasn't about medals or missions. It was about connection, the refusal to let distance or danger erase the bond between comrades. Historians deal in evidence, but memory deals in humanity. And somewhere between the two, in the cold March skis over a dying Reich, a small British aircraft carried a single, impossible purpose: to remind prisoners of war that they were not alone. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe.